And we're live with Angular Air. My name is Kent C. Dodds, and I am your host for this show, broadcast podcast, all about Angular. And this episode is about the new router that Brian Ford has built. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, everyone.
So we're super excited to have him on the show to talk about his last couple months of awesome work on this new router and what it means for Angular and its future. We also have some panelists, Jeff Welpley.
Hey.
And he's wearing an awesome shirt. And Patrick J.S.
Hey, guys.
And Olivier Combe.
Hello.
And let me just go through a couple quick announcements, and then we'll get into our show. So next week's show, June 23rd, same time, same place, with Victor Sopkin from the Angular team on Angular 2, forms specifically. And that should be a pretty exciting show. I'm pretty interested in forms. Yeah, and then as always, follow us on Google Plus and Twitter to keep up with the latest, and check out our website. I got it up there, angular-air.com. And yeah, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with some good questions here. So I think pertinent to this conversation, for some context, it'd be helpful if our viewers got a sense of what the purpose of a router is. Because, like, why can't I just use ngIfs or a big switch statement or something for my app? So what is the purpose of a router?
Yeah, so the router is kind of like a combination of switch statements and ngIf. No, the idea, though, is you want something that understands how your application has different states and how you might want to serialize and deserialize them to and from URLs. And then you also need to understand kind of different lifecycle concerns. So as you navigate away from something, as you navigate to something, you need to know this. That way you can maybe load extra code, you can load data from your server, you can ask the user, do you want to save? So these are all things that you kind of want together handled by a single thing. And that single thing is usually a router or a routing system. You often think of routing, if you have a long background with web development, you think of things in like PHP or in Ruby. Routing in Angular is just, you just manage the URL on the client with push state or pop state or with hash change events. And this is really important because one of like the interesting or cool things about the web is that it has URLs, and so you can copy and paste things, you can bookmark things, and so you want a system not just on the server but also on the clients. That way you can take advantage of all of this there as well.
Cool. And so you recently rewrote Angular's router. There was a previous router already called ngroute. Can you talk about some of the limitations of ngroute and why we couldn't just keep using ngroute?
Yeah, so ngroute came from a simpler time, a time when web apps were less complicated. So ngroute basically gives you a single spot on the page called ngview, and this is a spot that it loads content based on what route you're in. And so this is great, but it means that you only have a single level of routing. You can't use the same structure and nest it, for instance. You can't use multiple of them side by side. It's difficult to break it down into smaller pieces. And one of the big themes as Angular gets bigger and as we make more complex things is how can we make it easier for people to organize things into smaller chunks. And so that's where this new router, now called component router, comes in. So the big differences between the work that I've been doing and the existing routing system in Angular are that component router lets you do things at a much more granular level. So you can compose apps of almost smaller apps that each have their own routing. You can split up your logic into smaller, more fine-grained pieces, and then build a bigger, more complex app that still has all of these different routing abilities and still understands how each part interacts with the other, but in a more fine-grained way.
Cool. looking forward to actually using it. So maybe now I've totally lost my question. I need a panelist to come save me because I've blanked.
So there is, in addition to the existing NG router, there is a UI router that is out there today. So how can you talk a little bit about how the new router is different than the UI router, and whether moving forward there's space for both?
Yeah, so UI router is a great project that kind of rose out of the community, and specifically this Angular UI group that just produces lots of interesting things. And it tries to fill in a lot of the gaps in routing for Angular 1. So the things that it does a really good job of is it lets you do these nesting structures. I think it also lets you do multiple things. It lets you create like these abstract states that all have the same characteristics. So it does a good job there. But I think one of the things that we want to build upon based on their work is just the ability to like reuse things. So again, UI router is built on top of all of the same kind of ideas that were in Angular 1 or in kind of ng routing system, where you say, oh, you have a template and you have a controller, and you're going to smash them together, and that's going to be your route. And what we want to do is we want to have kind of one thing, and this is a component, and it has some business logic and it has an associated template, and we want to treat routing as going to that thing. And it's a little bit tricky because Angular 1's view system, you have this this hierarchy of scopes, and in Angular 2 there's still the same. You can still do all of the same things, but the idea is that you explicitly pass everything through. And so because of this, a lot of people have built their apps using UI router, ng route, in kind of a I would say a little bit more brittle way, where you rely on this scope hierarchy, and so you're not able to break things down quite as much, right? So the interesting thing, I think, between UI router, which actually has almost all of the same features as component router, and like component router itself, are that component router really helps you break down your app into smaller and smaller bits. And the other thing is that UI router, at least right now, doesn't understand Angular 2's templating system. I guess there's not a huge reason that it couldn't, besides it relies on all of Angular 1's services. But the component router is built so that way you can you build it into Angular 1 and you build it into Angular 2. So you have a set of directives that accomplish the same thing in both templating systems, but all of the core logic is the same. And so because of that, component router ends up being a good way, if you're interested in migrating between Angular 1 and Angular 2, that you can do it kind of piece by piece. So those are the main ideas. I would say, I don't like to look at it as UI router versus component router. Really, UI router did a really, really, really good job at figuring out what the features are and what the types of things that people want to do are. And I see component router as just building off of their work, really. So shout out to them. Good job, Angular UI team.
Cool. So will the new... Oh, somebody's feedbacking or giving some feedback. Can everybody you're not talking? I don't know why that sometimes happens in the middle of the show after we've already started. But my question is, the ng route, is that going to be deprecated now that there's or when the new router is officially released?
I don't think so. We haven't really talked about it much, but if you've been following along, even since before component router was a thing, we haven't really been adding too much to ng route. We actually originally ng route was part of core. It wasn't its own module. When you downloaded Angular.js, it just had all of this bundled with it. And what we were finding is that there's no reason that we can't separate it out into its own module. And we don't, at least at the time, we didn't have the ability to sit down and totally rethink that. There are so many other concerns in Angular core that we pulled it out. And so now, if you are doing something more complicated in Angular 1, you can use UI router or you can use ng-route, and you're not tied into one thing and you're not penalized for choosing one over the other. And so, long story short, like I don't think we're going to deprecate it necessarily, but it's going to probably continue along the same trajectory that it's been for the past year or so, which is it's not going to receive a whole lot of new features. So if you are doing something right now with ng-route and you're starting to feel limitations, you can actually switch to iRouter. I think they also have the ability to be API compatible with ng-route, and so that's a good step forward. And then from there, we want probably not an API compatibility layer, but some sort of shim or something that helps you. So if you've been building things with UI router, you're not kind of developing your way into a corner. You're not going off some separate way. It'll be easy to just to adopt component router from there when it's ready.
Oh, that's good to know. So how does the new router work? If I want to use it in a project, what do I have to import, and how do I have to configure my application?
Yeah, so right now, I guess maybe I should talk a little bit. Like the past couple of months have been just a series of build up, really super excited, like doing all this interesting conceptual work. Like, what if we move this piece over here? What if we move it over here? Oh, what about this use case? What about that use case? And like the longer you work on something, the more you find out you don't know. So it's just been a series of kind of false starts. So I'm not quite to the point yet where I'm ready to say it's good to use. Especially right now, I moved all of the code. So previously, all of the code was in the repo Angular/router. Now it's moved to Angular/Angular, which is the repo for Angular 2, and we just don't have all of the bits in place quite yet. So what you can do is, if you're using Angular 2, you can use the new router, and you can take a look at the integration tests and the examples to see how it works there. If you want to use component router with Angular 1, there's actually a PR open right now that adds the build system that allows you to take the Angular 2, the TypeScript Angular 2 parts, and transpile them and combine them with Angular 1 directives to get a build of the router for Angular 1. So right now, like the code base is in a state where I can't even quite release a new version of component router for Angular 1, but in the next couple of weeks, it'll be there. The exciting thing is that like every time we kind of go back to the drawing board, we learn something new, and it's for me been like super disappointing that I can't just release the router and say like, all right, go build things with it, because I know that it'll handle 99% of things super well, but I want to make sure that it's able to handle everything that we know how to make it handle, so that way we push the bounds of what you can do with routing in Angular even further, because people are much more creative than I am, and they'll come up with new interesting things that are totally valid. So we'll see. We're in kind of the middle of another transition period here, but probably in the next 2 weeks there'll be a better story for if you want to play around with it again.
I'm curious what led to the decision to do or to bring the router code into the same repo with Angular.
So right now it's mostly a constraint of the way that our build system works. So the build system to produce like the end output that a developer building an app would build for Angular 2 has been a long story. We started off. Man, it's a really, really long story. Okay, so there's these features that we want to add to JavaScript that are metadata annotations. So this would let you attach some information about a class or about a method on the class or about different arguments in a function, for instance. And we also want to be able to attach type information and be able to get a hold of this at runtime. And the reason is that if you look at how DI works in Angular 1, we have like a bunch of different not super great options, right? The first one is You just use a function, and we infer based on the name of the function what the service is that needs to be injected. And like this is obviously problematic communication. Like there was a lot of blowback in Angular 1 from this feature. So we've introduced like strict DI mode, so you get warnings if you haven't annotated things correctly. And then there are the different modes where you annotate things, and this involves adding an array of strings that describe what eventually will be injected in some function. And this is fine, but you end up duplicating a lot of information. So you end up writing, $HTTP as a string in an array, and then also $HTTP as a function argument. And this is also frustrating because these two pieces of information that are the same or that are related are like far away from each other in the code. And we want them to be right next to each other. So we wanted to add type information so that way you could say, oh, inject this thing here. And you could have the name of the argument be different from what the type was. So we had been working on this. Vojta, who no longer works on Angular, but is responsible for its DI system, kind of came up with this. I think it's all right to credit Sam. Came up with the idea of like using this metadata annotations from languages like Python, or I don't know if Ruby has it as well. But so we did this, and we came up with this thing called @script, which was really just JavaScript, ES6 JavaScript plus a feature that we wanted. And so we hacked the way that we implemented this like language, which again, it's not really its own language. It's just two features that we want to eventually add to JavaScript. The way that we hacked it together was we used Tracer, which takes ES6 and compiles it to ES5, and we hacked in support for the parts that we wanted. The interesting thing, though, is we wanted to add types, and we noticed that Microsoft had a very similar and kind of like-minded similar goal project called TypeScript. And TypeScript at that time was just ES5, so it didn't have fat arrow function, it didn't have all of the features of ES6. But it did have types, and the way that the types worked were totally in line with how we wanted types to work with @script. And so we'd been implementing Angular 2 for a long time using this system, and then we had to go over and switch to TypeScript once we decided that, oh, these two things should be the same. So the long story short is that for a long time, parts of the Angular 2 code base were TypeScript, and parts were like @script, or like this tracer compiled like semi-language thing. Now almost everything is in TypeScript, but that means that the work that I'd been doing on the routing system in @script and being able to transpile it needed to be reworked to work with this new build system. So while all of this was in flux, it was easier to develop the router in TypeScript in the Angular repo. Otherwise, you have to move all of this infrastructure into two places, or you have to pull it out into a common module. And the difficult part with that, it sounds like, oh, just have here's how Angular is built module. The problem with that, though, is that when the language is co-evolving with the thing that builds it, having them in separate places means that you end up having all of these like extraneous commits every time either one of them changes. And at that point, it's easier just to put them in the same repo, right? If every time you make a change to one thing, you also have to make a change to the other, then like you're not buying yourself anything by separating them out into modules. So we expect that to eventually settle down, and then the router can live in its own repo, and Angular itself can live in a separate repo, and everything will be super modular and nice. But while things are kind of moving targets, it just doesn't make sense. So long story short, right now the Angular router code is all in the Angular 2 repo, and from there it'll probably live for a while, but it'll still be able to build the Angular 1 bits. And if you look on the issue tracker, there is an open PR from me on this. I hope to get that merged in the next couple of days, but there's only so many hours in the day, and there's still other kind of big conceptual refactorings that we're doing. So stay tuned. It's an interesting time.
Lots of stuff there. That was good. Interesting stuff.
Yes.
So I was wondering, if we want to write an app for Angular 2 and Angular 1, is this something that we can do as well, or is this really too complicated?
I would say it doesn't really make sense because an end user is only going to want to see one app. Like, I think what will be possible, and what I hope is that out of this, out of the router, I'll be able to extract the things that let you kind of produce both. But you'll have to implement directives separately always. But for things like services, it totally makes sense to share them between both versions of Angular. And it's cool because using the infrastructure they developed, you could use ES6, or you could even use TypeScript features and then transpile them down and get all of the benefits of that whole ecosystem, but still use it in an Angular 1 app. So other members of the team are also interested in this. I think our improved localization support will probably go the same route. Jeff Cross is working on a better data and persistence story, and I think this will go the same route. So the cool thing is all of the work that we're doing that is for Angular 2 but isn't on the view and the templating system, all of that will hopefully be able to be used in Angular 1 without too much difficulty. And if you write third-party services for Angular, you'll also be able to make use of this, is my hope.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm really quick. I'm going to tangent. I keep forgetting to do this, but for anybody who's watching live, you can actually, if you're watching on the Hangouts page, not on YouTube, you can ask questions using the Q&A app in Hangouts, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the show. Yeah, sorry to kind of stop the flow of our show, but I need to remember to ask that, or to mention that, because nobody's asking questions yet. I feel like there are a lot of questions to be asked. So, yeah. Anyway, carry on, Patrick. I think you've got a good question here.
I have two of them, but first one is, what are the key features for the new router?
So I think the key features are just that routing takes place at a component level. So this means you can have multiple, we're calling them outlets in component router, but they're the same thing as ngView. They're the place that you put content that depends on the route. And so you can have multiple of these in each component that has routing information. And you can add this routing information, this route configuration, to any component. So the way that you build up a complex app is not by just defining a long list of routes like you would before in your route provider, but rather you put them close to the part of your app that matters. And so the interesting thing is that you could even, if you're a huge company, you could each build separate mini apps that work independently, and then combine them all together so it's just a giant single page app. The router also has support for lazy loading built in mind. So, this idea of my entire giant company is a single single page app. Sorry, single page app. Wow, that's tongue twister. Isn't so crazy. So that's kind of the main thing. There's just a whole level of flexibility there. You can also, there's this idea of this pipeline, or kind of these different steps that you take every time you do a navigation. And there are pre-built-in ones for common hooks. So if you navigate away from something, you might want to ask the user, are you sure? Do you want to persist your data? When you arrive at a page, you might want to record that information. You might want to do some data fetching. Before you navigate to anything, you might want to do certain actions. So the interesting thing is that you can, again, define all of this on a per component basis and then easily compose it together. And then you can even add your own kind of steps in here. So if the couple hooks that we give you out of the box aren't enough, you can just add whatever additional things that you need in there. So this will be great for kind of middleware type things. So if you want to do authentication, or you want to do some complex permission model, Angular doesn't want to ship with something super opinionated like that is pervasive throughout your entire app. But we want to make sure that this is something that you can do. And so we want to kind of make sure that we have APIs that give you access to all of this.
Also, this work for libs, external libs, I think. You can write a tabulation lib, for example, and have your own route for each tab, and just release this on GitHub, and it can plug into your app.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, having components that know how to do navigation, I think, is also going to be a big thing. So yeah, like a tab box, or like an accordion, or any of these things, being able to make reusable versions of them that have routing baked into them is like super big, I think.
Now, speaking about components, there was a change recently of removing multiple components per route. Can you talk a little bit about that decision and what it means moving forward?
Yeah, so maybe I should clarify. If you pull down the Angular repo and grep for router, you'll find a commit that says that we're pulling out the support for this type of configuration, and that's maybe a little bit facetious, because what the goal there was to simplify the code temporarily in order to make room for kind of a more generalized version of the same thing. So one limitation to the previous way that you could have multiple outlets is that they couldn't each independently kind of do their own thing. So each of those outlets would have a component inside of it, and if that component wanted to capture part of the URL and do something with it, both siblings had to basically agree on what to do. And so that ended up being really restrictive and only useful for a couple cases. Really what you want is you want to be able to have two components that you're routing to side by side, and for them to be totally just disjoined and each have their own routing. So we're introducing this new, more general kind of routing, and right now we're calling it, I guess, auxiliary routes or sibling routes, but new sibling routes. I don't know. We're still figuring out like how we want to describe this, but the idea is that every route has, or every component rather, it has the ability to capture some part of the URL, and then it also has the ability to delegate whatever it doesn't capture to a child. We want to, I mean, this is how you nest components basically. But we also want to support the case where you might have, this is the main part of your app, but you might have popover that is on the screen, and that popover might have, or I guess not popover, that modal dialog rather, might have some routing information inside of it as well. You can imagine like upload file dialog, and it has a bunch of different steps in it, and it's implemented as a modal. And you still want to capture this in the URL, because maybe you have some background upload thing with service workers, right? Like there are all sorts of crazy use cases that are now possible thanks to these new APIs coming to the web. So we want to be able to capture those states as well, things like modals, or things like where you have two things side by side on the page or on top of each other that act independently. And so the way that this works is we introduce a new grammar to our URL parser, and we make it possible so that way at each level of routing you can say there are these parts that go to this particular child, and these parts that go to the primary child, and they can each have their own separate history, and they can each capture their own things. And so this means that everything is a first-class citizen, even these auxiliary routes, and so you can compose anything in the routing world together. Whereas before, you could only compose certain things, right? Like they had to, everything in the system had to agree, and so it wasn't really truly very modular. So
when you,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, I just had a question about that, because when you have individual pieces that are affecting the URL, the one challenge when you're talking about, on the server side, some of the stuff that Patrick and I are working on, sometimes you want to do static analysis to know all the routes up front. So if you have individual pieces acting independently affecting the URL, it kind of makes it harder to do that. So are you doing anything to allow for kind of a static analysis to say, okay, just give me all the possible routes in this app?
Yeah, so because, so there's two ways to configure the router. There's actually a question that touches on this later. One way is you use annotations, and annotations can be statically analyzed. So the answer is totally. You can statically analyze the code, and you can see all of the routes in the system. At runtime, you already know all of the routes in the system, except ones that are based on components that are lazily loaded. But yeah, the long story short is that you can totally do this. You can programmatically add routes, and obviously you can't statically analyze that, but that's a trade-off that you, the developer, would already know about.
Okay.
Awesome. So what where I'm working right now, we're using UI Router and loving it, and we've built an abstraction on top of it that just makes it kind of nice and things, and hopefully that helps us move to the new router. But there are some things about the UI Router that our abstraction depends on, and so I'm curious, and I think lots of the people who are watching or listening would be curious because UI Router is just so huge. Are there some features from UI Router that definitely won't be reflected in the new router, or definitely will, that you can speak to at all, or are you very familiar with the UI Router and how it compares?
I'm somewhat familiar. I know looking at issues that, like, two things that people are super concerned about are being able to, like, use this resolver thing. This is also something that exists in ng-route. And the answer is, like, yes, you'll totally be able to do that. That's just another hook in the pipeline. It's similar to can activate or can deactivate. It's just we just haven't implemented that hook. We just haven't put that hook there. So totally, we need something that says, we need these additional resources to be injected, and we need to wait until that happens before moving on. And there are a bunch of different use cases that particular feature captures. The other one that I get a lot of questions about is abstract routes. And so I've thought about this a lot because I also know that abstract routes are something that are, like, kind of confusing or not always understood by people first using it. And so we capture the same use case where you have some behavior that's shared between components, or some routing that's shared between it, but we know that it's not kind of the terminal thing that you're routing to, right? Like, there's more things that you need to capture. And so the way that works in component router is you just have a component that has no template associated with it. Right? So components without any sort of template are just considered abstract, and they can use all of the same hooks. So what happens is during the kind of recognition phase of routing, we don't have to treat the abstract case as special, and so that's really nice. And then during the phase where we kind of, like, put everything into place, we just look, and if there's no template, we just continue down. And so it actually ends up being really simple, and conceptually, there doesn't have to be a separate name for it. This is just, you just don't have a template for this particular thing. All right. So it's nice. So the answer is, wherever possible, we've kind of generalized parts of UI Router, and anytime that we can generalize things or simplify things, that way there are fewer concepts or fewer, like, APIs, we've done that. So this doesn't mean that, like, you can't do those particular things. It just means they might not have the same name, or mechanically they might be just slightly different. But really, like, one of the main things that we took away from UI Router was the different use cases that people have. So we absolutely want to make sure that you can do all the same things.
Cool. Yeah, I like the idea of simplifying, because abstract routes takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around, and, like, why can't I activate this thing? Yeah, so that's cool.
Sweet. So right now you could configure routes through annotation, or you could either inject the router to configure your routes. But what about configuring it declaratively in the template? What are your thoughts on that? Similar to React Router.
Yeah, I actually think this is a really interesting idea. I don't think that it necessarily makes sense for Angular, because I think that using annotations kind of is more idiomatic or more aligned with Angular. But the cool thing is that because you can programmatically add routes, you could totally implement directives that just say, grab the routing at my level of component and configure it accordingly. So like it would actually be trivial to implement that same system. So I think it's super interesting. I'm curious if maybe Ryan Florence, who implemented React Router, I think he still works on it anyway, is would use annotations, or if annotations get added to ES7 or something, if React Router would consider adding that as an API. Because the cool thing about having it in templates or having it in annotations is that you can statically analyze it, which means that you can do all sorts of cool tricks. And either place totally makes sense. And I think Angular and React have almost opposite ideas on like where like the boundaries of templates should be, and where the boundaries of like controller logic should be. So I think that would be interesting. I think it'd be interesting from both directions. So we'll have to see. It's just at the end of the day, you have to choose one thing, or like one or two things, and I think annotations make the most sense. But who knows? Maybe in 2 years we'll be doing the same thing that React Router is doing.
Cool. So we actually we're coming down on time, so we might have time for one more question, and then we have some Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. Does anybody have anything else that they desperately wanted to ask, or Brian, do you have anything else you desperately wanted to talk about?
Nope. I would rather use the time for other people's questions.
Okay. Then I think we'll jump in. We've got a couple questions in here. So, first question from Butch Peters is, when composing a large app out of smaller independent apps with component router, will the components be lazy loaded by the router, or do we still need to load everything up front?
So this is tricky. There's an API for Angular 1.5 that we're still trying to figure out how the details of this works. But the idea is that it allows you to lazily add things to Angular's DI system. This may or may not involve introducing hierarchical routes, and it may or may not also involve, for Angular 1, just wholesale adopting the same type of DI system that Angular 2 has. This is like kind of the main thing that we're still trying to figure out, because there's no, right now there's is Oliver still there? So I don't think that there's a I don't think there's a good way. The best way to lazily add things to Angular is Oliver's library, I think. But
thank you.
We don't want to add this sort of functionality unless we can do so in a very like safe, deterministic way, meaning that you always are able to know whether or not your app will work. So the main thing that we want to avoid is the case where if you navigate to one route and then you navigate to another route, it works. But if you navigate differently, somehow something doesn't get loaded and it doesn't work. And right now, the way Angular's DI system is, it just puts everything into a big bucket, and so you can't really know. It doesn't really reflect the dependencies between different Angular modules. And so we want to, if we add the ability to core to do this, we also want to make sure that either the whole system always fails and like, throws a really helpful error, or the whole system always works. Like, you shouldn't ever be in the state though where like you have bugs that are difficult to track down. And so that's really what we're trying to figure out. Like, we want to make sure that people building really, really big apps, even if it's the case where it's like, oh well, you forgot to load this in, so it's you the developer's fault. Like, we want to make sure that like we give you that information. Like, otherwise, there's so many crazy things that can happen. So, depending on that, the router, I think, will know how to do this correctly. And the way that it works is you just in your configuration, you say, I'm routing to a component that will be lazily loaded. Rather than tell you what the component is, I'm going to give you a function, call this function, and it will do the lazy loading. And then the way that you'll get this function is it'll be like it'll be something that comes out of Angular, kind of partially applied. So you'll say, hey, Angular, I want to lazy load this component, and there'll be a nice mechanism where you won't have to make the HTTP request yourself. In Angular 1, there'll probably be another module or something you have to pull in, or you're welcome to use whatever your favorite loader is. In Angular 2, this will probably involve just a wrapper on system.js. So we'll see. I mean, the goal is to make it as easy as possible, but also make sure that we're like respectful of developers using other things in the ecosystem, and make sure that if you're using AMD or if you're using Webpack or whatever you're using, it works well for you.
Cool. That's very considerate. +1 to Olivier's library for lazy loading on Angular 1.
Yeah, but I have to agree that in Angular 1 there are cases where this is difficult to predict the output. Run blocks, for example, are really difficult to lazy load, because usually they just want to configure your application, and if you do that after Bootstrap, well, you never know what will happen. So yeah.
It's a tough problem, so we'll see. I think for now, Olivia, you can use his solution if you want something immediate, or there'll be something I think a little bit. It'll handle these sort of edge cases better, and then we'll come with Angular 1.5.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thanks for your work. So next question is from Mark Struck. Is the component router going to allow for caching of components? I'm not totally certain I understand. I'm thinking maybe this is the code or for the component. Maybe you know.
So there's a bunch of different ways that you can deal with caching. So already something that's implemented, if you try and route to a component and you say I want this instance of, or I want this type of component rather, with these parameters, it'll just reuse the same instance. I think the trick is if you navigate to one part of your app and then you navigate back to where you were before, will it reuse the same instances? And the answer is I want there to be a mechanism to do this, but I want it to be pluggable. So it's still a little bit of an open question. I don't think that the router itself should just like wholesale say, oh yeah, like we're going to persist this around with this like LRU cache, and we'll use this particular algorithm because caching is something that's very application specific, and maybe there's a good default that handles 90% of the use cases, but we're not far enough along that we know what that would be. So yes, I want to support it. I'm not exactly sure how it'll look though.
Cool. Sounds good. So that's all of our Q&A questions. And from my, as a summary, I guess, for the router, it's still in development. You can use it on some use cases. It might not be super easy to do in Angular 1, but it's super awesome already, and it's going to be even more awesome. So, cool. Does anybody have any other questions or thoughts before we move into the tips and picks?
Yeah, I think that Jeff should ask one of his questions.
Well, I just had a question in here, more to your just talking about the massive effort that you've been putting in, Brian. There's a huge amount of work being done on the router, and you could see that with I think there's something like 150 open issues and 24 pull requests, and you could tell a lot of activity there. So I'm wondering, what's your blood to Red Bull ratio at this?
Oh, Red Bull ratio. Okay, I understand now. Gotcha. When I first heard this question, I didn't understand what blood to Red Bull ratio meant. Okay, it's I don't know. It's pretty good. I don't drink a lot of Red Bull. There's a lot of caffeine in me, not from Red Bull though. Okay, so let's see. Numbers are hard. I don't want to say it's a pet peeve of mine, but I'm always unsure how to answer questions about like GitHub pull request issue numbers, because issues mean so many different things for all sorts of different use cases or repos. For the router, I think I've handled issue tracking a little bit differently. A lot of the times when people are talking to me at a conference or something, I just say, can you file an issue and describe what you want to do? Like there may or may not be a way to do it, but it's really hard unless you see code to do this. So there are tons of issues open on the router that are just use cases that may or may not actually be doable right now with the current feature set. But I've at least read all of them. I'm aware of all of them, and the whole system is designed to encompass all of them once everything is fully implemented. There are a lot of just bugs sitting around on Angular/router, and a lot of that is just because there hasn't been a release that targets Angular 1 since moving over to the Angular repo. And this is, again, just because there's been a lot of things in flux. So it's tricky, and it is not just in my control. This is something that everyone working on all of the different parts of Angular has been working super hard to get our build system a little bit better and more robust, and also handle TypeScript moving over to that. And this will you'll see the fruits of this labor very soon. Let's see, and then after all of the dust settles, the kind of higher level, oh, I want this feature kind of pull requests. A lot of them are, you can already do this without this feature. A lot of them are, oh, you're right, this is just not implemented yet, and it's not that it's an oversight, but it's that there's only so many hours in the day, and all of those will start to rapidly decrease. So we'll see. I've been working super hard, but the focus over the past couple of months has been more kind of conceptual, high-level things, and less just doing rote bug fixes. So every time I get to the oh, we just need to polish kind of phase, we realize that there's yet something else that we need to incorporate, whether it be animations, or whether it be some crazy use case, or whether we've accidentally invented a global registry somewhere, or there's just all sorts of things.
Cool. I can't even imagine having over 100 issues on any of my repos. I'd be totally freaked out.
It means I have good job security, though.
Yeah, that's a good point. Unfortunately, my job on GitHub doesn't pay me. We did get one other question on Q&A, and this is from Erwin Mombe. And his question is, can you have a route that has multiple components that it can instantiate, dynamic components?
Yes, this will be this new auxiliary routing, this new sibling routing, sometimes called double/slash routing, because we've invented a new kind of URL. It's going to be super hip. Just watch out for it, and you'll see what I mean. It's going to be exciting.
Double/slash routing, is that like two slashes right next to each other in the URL?
It's forthcoming. You'll see it. You'll see it soon.
Cool.
I don't want to ruin any surprises.
All right. This is Apple think different moment. Just kidding. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the picks and tips and wrap up the show. So Jeff, why don't we go with you first?
Sure. So I have 3 quick picks. The first is Patrick's hair. It's awesome. The second is sort of stealing the thunder from something Patrick loves. I'm really a big fan of Falcor, Netflix's library. I've been keeping an eye on their repo as they've kind of been trying stuff out, and it's really amazing to see kind of how it's kind of grown in the past month or so, and I think they're close to being able to release that soon. And the last thing is I actually watched, Kent, your video with CodeShip on CI deployment, and I enjoyed it a lot, so I would put that in as a pick as well.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, that was a good discussion, I think. Hopefully people benefit. So, Olivier, why don't we go with you next?
Yeah, so I have 2 this week. One is this new article from Pascal Precht about Angular, the routing in Angular 2. And I think that he will have to rewrite half of the article after this show, but it's still interesting. If you want to know more about the syntax, because obviously we couldn't talk a lot about that. And the other one is, I don't know if I already talked about, it's the Angular bed is Slack channel. I know that there is an official GitHub channel for Angular, but this one on Slack is, I guess, a little bit less technical, more like buddies talking and doing Angular stuff. So it's cool if you want to join us. It's free, and you can hang out with us. Yeah, that's it.
Cool. I'm on there sometimes. It's fun. So I'll go ahead and go next. So if you watched the show earlier in like February, you'll notice that I had glasses, and now I no longer have glasses, and it's not because I got contacts, but I got LASIK, and it's awesome. So I picked LASIK, and I got it at Hoops Vision, which is this place here in Utah that is super, super awesome. And so I picked them, and LASIK in general. Not having glasses is awesome. And then my second pick is Gleb Bamatov. He has tons of really awesome modules, so I pick him. He's got a PhD in computer science or computer-related something, and just like super, super smart. And it's not just his modules on NPM, but he also has some really, really good blog posts about some interesting kind of different concepts. Like one of the scary ones that like threw me for a loop for a sec was he actually runs unit tests in production sometimes. Yeah, pretty wild, but like very, very good stuff. So anyway, I pick him. Let's go with Patrick JS. What do you got for us?
Sorry, I muted myself there, but Angular U. So Jeff and I are giving a talk on server-side rendering with Angular 2. So I picked that. I have another pick, which is super important, probably the best pick in here. It's Bulba T. Everyone should try it out if you haven't already. And then the third pick is Blastoise from Pokemon. He's pretty cool.
Neat. Okay, and Brian, what do you have?
Oh, this is not fair. Patrick totally saw my pick, and he chose the other one beforehand. But my pick was Pokemon in general, but especially Charizard. I feel like this is in the game where like you choose your starter and the other guy chooses the other starter, and like they always line it up so that way your guy loses. I feel like that's what just happened here with me and Patrick. No, okay. So my serious one is Stalker, the Tarkovsky film. I recently watched it and I think it was cool. And then my Angular pick is like it's like a reverse pick. So I really like domain names, and so I bought Angular.cool. Angular is obviously cool, but I don't know what to do with its domain name. So if anyone watching the show has an awesome suggestion, you should let me know.
I almost bought Angular.news and Angular.block, but yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people had the same idea, but there's only one man here who has Angular.cool.
I love all these new top-level domain names, but I would feel pretty like conceited to buy can'tseedots.cool.
You have to earn .cool.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, rad. So. All right. So good picks. We'll get those in the podcast links and stuff. So. Brian, thank you so much for coming on to the show. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about the new router.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Yeah, and thanks even more for working on it.
That's my job.
So with just really quick, some more announcements just to close this up. So June 23rd, next week, at same time, we have Victor Sofkin on Angular 2 forums. And it's going to be awesome, so be there. And then follow us on Twitter and Google Plus to keep up to date with the latest. And yeah, that's it. So thanks everybody for coming. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.